Have you ever wondered, or just not wondered, but just thought about your hands and how important your hands are? I think, and I'm like this, I don't even think about them most days. I just use them. And God, I mean, the way He designed us is so wonderful. And I never really thought much about my hands and how much I use them until I met a friend of mine named Ramon several years ago in Russia. And I'm sure I've mentioned him before, but he's a gentleman I went up to. He came to church one Sunday. I went up to meet him. He was standing in the back, and I reached out my hand to shake his hand. He had his hands in his pocket like this. He stood there and looked at my hand for a moment or two, and then he pulled his arm out, and there was no hand on it. And then he pulled the other hand out, and there was no hand on it. And he had lost them. Somebody had robbed him in the middle of the night. One night there in Siberia, it was minus 30 degrees, left him lying on the side of the road, and by the time the police found him, it was too late to save his hand, severe frostbite, and they had to amputate it. But I used to watch him struggle through life, and he could do very little for himself. His wife did everything. I mean, she had to feed him. She had to button his shirt, zip his pants. I mean, everything. You know, think about it. We use our hands to pick things up, to throw things, to drive our cars, to write, to feed ourselves, to tie our shoes, button our clothes. Some of us couldn't count without our hands. I'm one of them. 1, 2, 3. I need my fingers to count. Okay? When we get frustrated with some situation, we say, well, it's out of my hands. Or, I'm just going to wash my hands of it. Remember Pilate? The night that they brought Jesus to him to stand trial, the Jews wanted to condemn him. He couldn't even find a crime to convict him on. But the Jews were adamant. The Pharisees were adamant. Jesus had to be condemned. And finally, he called for a pitcher of water to come out. And he washed his hands in their presence to show to the people that I'm done with this. I'm not guilty of his death. You are. Moses, I think, was a man who felt that way probably many times regarding God's people. Even from the very beginning. He tried to do something to help them, and he failed miserably. In fact, they rejected him. Remember the life of Moses? Born to slavery, adopted by an Egyptian princess, and then he killed a man who was abusing one of his people, a fellow Jew. And to escape, he ran away and left Egypt. Ever wondered what it was like, what it was like for Moses, the years he spent there in exile in Midian? And it wasn't just for a few years, it was 40 years. I know it might have felt like I've been here 40 years, but I've only been here 2. Really less than 2. But he was there for 40 years. And I wonder about it. I'm sure they were... he was separated from everything familiar to him. And I think they were years of doubt and discouragement for Moses. He probably felt alone and forgotten by God. Exodus chapters 3 and 4, they tell us the story of what we call the story of the burning bush. And Moses sees this bush on fire up on the mountainside, and he could tell it's not being consumed. And so he decides to go out and look at it. And he gets up there and he finds out that it's a manifestation of God. God appears to him in this burning bush and to speak to him. And he tells Moses that I'm going to send you to Egypt to free my people. I want you to listen to what God and Moses says to one another at that moment. Turn to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3, verse 11. I'm wondering why I can't see my notes. I have my distance glasses on for driving and not my reading glasses for reading. That's better. I could see you guys pretty good. Okay? Exodus chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I'll be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. God chose the man Moses to deliver his people from the Egyptians and to lead them to the promised land. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but I have. But it seems like God has a bad habit of waiting until we are too weak to do his will before he calls us. Have you noticed the people that he waited until Moses was 80 years old? I'm 62 and I wouldn't want to go. And Moses didn't want to go. He said, "Who am I?" And he gave God here in these verses, he gave some 3 excuses for why he should not go. He said, first, I'm unworthy. Have you ever felt that way? Okay. And I hear you. We feel that way, don't we? Or if I go, no one's going to believe me. And that's true. They didn't at first. He went on, he said, well, I like eloquent of being able to speak. I have a speech problem, God. And I'll add this one in, not to mention he's 80 years old. To me, that would disqualify him right then and there. Why don't you look at God's answer to Moses' excuses? Look at chapter 4 of Exodus, starting in verse 1. Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out, took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. You notice how God dealt with all of his excuses? Asked a simple question. Moses, what's that in your hand? And Moses looked and he says, it's a staff. It's just an ordinary plain wooden staff. God told Moses then to throw it on the ground. He threw it on the ground and he found out it wasn't just a plain ordinary wooden staff. It was now a snake. And I like Moses' reaction. His reaction is like a lot of us would run from it. My son would have ran to it. My son, when he was growing up, when he'd see a snake, and he had eyes that he could see snakes in the grass. And he'd run towards it and try to pick it up. You don't think that's not scary? But Moses, he sees the snake and he runs away from it. But he comes back when God tells him to come and pick it up. You see, in this scene, we see a frail, weak man that God is planning on using with only what he has in his hand. I want you to appreciate what God's doing here. This is significant, what God's up to. He's taken this 80-year-old old man. You know, when most of us we've long passed the point of thinking about retirement at age 80. I mean, we're retired, okay? That's it. And he's calling him for his greatest work. He's calling him to go and confront the most powerful nation on earth with a wooden staff. And see, that's the way God works in our lives. He only needs what we have in our hand. You know, let's put it in perspective what happened here. When Moses threw his staff on the ground and then he picked it up, Moses was experiencing the trustworthiness of God's word. See, God always does what he says he's going to do. And that's important to us because our blessings and our salvation is tied to the promises of God. And when we yield ourselves to God's will, we too will experience the trustworthiness of his word. When we yield ourselves to God's will, we'll find ourselves in a situation where we're going to be inadequate. And all that God needs from us at that moment is what we have in our hand. I mean, look at what God did with Moses' ordinary wooden staff. Moses touched the Nile River with it. Remember what happened? It turned to blood. He brought on a plague of frogs out of the water. He struck the ground with his staff and the dust became gnats. He stretched it towards heaven and fire and thunder and hell was brought down. He brought a plague of locusts upon the land. He divided the Red Sea. He struck a rock in the middle of the desert and water gushed out. And when he held it high in the air, his warriors prevailed in battle. That's a powerful staff, isn't it? Wouldn't you like to have a staff like that? It's not the staff. It was God's power that prevailed. Moses' staff in his hands, it represented several things. It represented first God's authority. I've had nothing to do with Moses. Nothing magical in the staff. It was God's authority that was behind the staff. It represented God's work. And figuratively, God moved a mountain with that staff. He brought to its knees the Pharaoh of Egypt. He can do the same thing to the Pharaoh of the United States, too, if he so wanted to. It represented God's deliverance because, see, He delivered his people with a piece of wood. Throughout history, God has always used what was in the hands of men to prove His power and His authority. I mean, think about some of the incidences we know. There's a young boy, young boy, and he went out and he faced a warrior giant with a sling. Think about that. He kept alive a widow and her son through a famine with only enough food for one meal for months. And what about that little boy with a sack lunch? That little boy that came to hear Jesus, all he had, he brought a sack lunch with him, and Jesus took that sack lunch and fed 5,000 people. When God asked, "What's in your hand?" we need to realize that God cannot use anything in our hands unless we're first willing to let go of it. Something that we all have in our hands is time. It's something we all have. And we all have the same amount of it. I hear this a lot from people. I don't believe it. In fact, I've even used it a few times. I didn't believe it when I used it either. I don't have enough time. I can't do that, or I didn't do that because I just didn't have enough time. You know what we're really saying when we say that? It's not important to me. Oh, that's what we're saying. We're saying it wasn't important to me. Because we always have the time to do the things we want to do. I've noticed that about people. We take the time to do the things that are important to us. But if it's not important to us, we just don't have enough time. See, time is an investment. Time is more important than money. You know, I see people, they drive all over town to save 10 cents. And I just ask them sometimes, I just tell them sometimes, you know what? My time's more valuable than that. I'll give them an extra 10 cents. Think about the rich fool. Remember the rich fool? Not supposed to call people fools, right? But Jesus called him a rich fool. There in Luke chapter 12. Turn there. Let's look at his story for a second. Luke chapter 12, verse 16 is where we're going to start. Let me read this. Ask yourself this question. What was more valuable to him at that moment, his money or his time? Luke 12, verse 16. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but not rich towards God." What was more valuable at that moment? His time or his money? You know, if you ask him, he'd say, oh, my money. Because, see, we always sit here and think we all have plenty of time, don't we? But his time was rapidly running out. This is sad. In fact, I reconfirmed this statistic just this week. Only 17% of Americans go to church full time. You'll hear a statistic that 40% of Americans go to church. Those are people that say they go to church occasionally. But if you break it down to those who dedicate a time each week to go to church, only 17% of Americans go to church. That means 83% of all Americans don't think God is important enough to give a couple of hours each week. That's what that's saying. We need to be warned. See, we store up riches towards God through the way we use our time. And if you don't give God enough time, you're not storing up riches for Him. Listen to what Jesus said in Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Another thing we all have, and we have it in varying degrees, I'll admit that, energy. And as I get older, the more I cherish energy because I find out I don't have as much as I used to have. We have all of our grandkids at the house. I'm tired just by watching them expend energy. I sit in my recliner and watch them run around and scream. I watch their parents chase after them. And I'm tired, guys. It's rough sitting in that chair when all that activity is going on. I've heard people complain about why they don't attend church or Bible study, and they just say, and they said, I'm too tired to attend. And you want to know something? I believe them. I believe them. We live in a world that is demanding more and more of our energy. But here's the thing. If we're too busy and too tired to expend energy for God, then we're too busy. Now, I've not always been a minister. First half of my adult life, I worked. I was first in the Army, and then I worked in business for over 20 years. I had a very demanding job, took a lot of energy out of me. It was called one of the top 10 most stressful jobs in America. Believe me, I have the stomach to prove it today. My wife worked full time. We had children who were very active. They were in sports and dance and other clubs and stuff, and we were chasing after them. And there were times on Wednesday night, Denise and I, we'd come home and we'd look at each other and I'd say, I'm tired. And I'd say, I'm tired too. And then we'd get up, feed the kids, and go to church. I can say this all honesty. We never didn't go to church because we were too tired. We made a commitment to ourselves that as a family, when we need to be at church, we're going to be there. Because we knew we needed it, and we knew our children needed it. And we were there. See, we considered it vital and important to our family. But see, I think we treat too many times our time and our energy like the rich fool treated his. We all get tired in this life. This life can be exhausting. But it's no excuse. In fact, God takes that into account. He knows. God knows how we feel and how much energy we're expending. I want you to listen to another verse here. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 29 through 31. Isaiah here speaking of our God. And he says, He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youth grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. We will soar on wings like eagle. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. You know, there were times I was tired when I went to church, but I felt like I had more energy when I left. There were quite a few times I felt like that. You know, there's something else too. Too often I think we feel like Moses, and we ask this question, who am I to do this? You know, I feel that way every Sunday. I feel that time every time I get up to do a sermon or lead a Bible study, every time I meet with someone to talk with them about the Bible or some issue that they want to talk about. And I think this. I do. Maybe there's somebody else that could do a better job. Who am I to be here? And you know what? I think there's plenty of people that could do a better job than I'm doing. And there's times I felt like Moses. You know, Moses when he says, here am I to God, send Aaron. No, Moses never said that. But I guarantee you, I'm sure he felt that way. Because there's been times I've felt that way. But then I think about this. They're not here, but I am. And I believe that God wants to use me. Because here's the thing. None of us are worthy. None of us are adequate for the task. Paul said, I'm not adequate for the task. But he's the one God chose. Moses wasn't adequate for the task. But he's the one God chose. And for better or worse, we're here now in Henderson, Nevada. Moses' story tells us that not feeling adequate is no excuse for not serving God and allowing Him to work through us and through our limited talents. And I've heard Christians say, well, I'm just not gifted enough to go out and do whatever. You know, lots of times I find my gifts come as I try to do something that maybe I don't feel like I'm able to do. And I find out, you know what, there's more going on. Because you know what, that wooden staff wasn't very talented either. But look what all it did. It's not about who is not here. It's about God using those of us who are here, broken and weak and tired as we are, to do His will. And here's what God is trying to get us to see in the life of Moses. It doesn't matter our size, how many of us there are, or how old we are, or even how wealthy or popular we are. What matters, are we willing to let go of what we have and allow God to use what is in our hands? Are we willing to do that? See, God is not looking for people who are the best for the job. He's looking for those who will yield to Him what they're carrying in their hand. That's all God wants. Are you willing to let go of what you have? Are you willing to let God use what you have in your hand? Are you willing to surrender all to Him? And if you are, we have an invitation song for you today. Please don't pass up this opportunity. If you realize, I need to come and confess my faith in God and then be buried with Him in baptism, we can do that today for you. Maybe you have some other need that you need to express to the church and ask for prayers. Whatever it is, we want to invite you to come today while we stand and sing.